Suicide is considered the third leading cause of death among teens in the United States. The Center for Disease Control estimates as much as 5% of teen suicides occur in clusters. In the past 6 months, 4 teenagers have taken their own lives at the East Meadow Drive crossing near Gunn High School. I pulled up some data about the occurrences of words like Palo Alto, teen, and suicide in Google News, and I think it does a pretty good job of indicating the trajectory of the story I chose. As we see in the top chart, there's peak coverage after each suicide, May, June, August, and October. But it should be noted that May is really only a bleep on the radar, since it was still thought of as a relatively isolated act before the media knew it would become a so-called copycat phenomenon. On to the bottom graph. The press made no mention of the word cluster in discussing the May suicide. In June, though, we see a spike after another student, this time a 17-year-old girl, killed herself at the same location. 2 generally doesn't constitute a cluster, but something else happened in June. Something that I think triggered the story to take on a new dimension. After Palo Alto, community members held a suicide forum. A young man went to the same Meadow Drive location and attempted suicide, but his mother was able to intervene and save his life by actually pulling him off the track. So this attempted suicide, I think, really shifted the media awareness to this being a serious instance of a cluster. Then, in October and November, we see the media in full swing discussion of this phenomena as a cluster. From looking at the headlines, which I'll show you in a minute, I found that the second suicide and the attempted third in August caused a media stir, but the press wasn't totally abuzz until the actual third act in August. But the stories fizzle out in January. October and November, we see less of a peak, but a more constant, steady coverage. I'm interested to see if this trend carries out through December. I didn't include May's suicide here because the media covered it pretty normally, and actually rather lightly. But in June, we see local and regional papers take up the story and either write it as a hard news story with brief mention of what happened in May, or the media would frame the story around a need for the city to address teen depression, or they'd take an angle that highlighted the attempted suicide that shadowed the initial successful one. Some of the titles of the stories here that I've pulled are Tragedy Strikes Twice at Palo Alto School. That's the one I have up here under June. Another one from June was Anguish, Alarm Over Teen Suicides on Caltrain. And another was Palo Alto, School Officials Talk About Teen Depression. And then in August, we see the stories expanding to a much larger network. Some headlines from then: Teen hit by train at Palo Alto crossing dies. Teen killed by Caltrain in Palo Alto. Latest Caltrain teen suicide prompts warning. When local outlets here in Palo Alto wrote about the string of suicides, the coverage sparked debate on whether reporting on issues could cause more suicides in a sort of copycat fashion. Here's Police Chief Dan Ryan.
By showing videos of the passing train, the loud train steaming down its corridor, we make that more accessible in the minds of someone else who's feeling troubled or feeling depressed.
One of the waves in this story came with the last suicide, when the community basically said enough is enough. Palo Alto Police Department contracted a security company out of Oakland a few weeks ago to stand guard at the tracks. A local group called Track Watch was also staking out at the tracks, and it's formed, but the group doesn't really like to use the word suicide. Instead, and it calls it the S word, and it says the suicide was an incident or a misuse of the tracks, because they're afraid that suicide, or that using the word suicide, will contribute to more copycats. And this is one of the groups that's been very vocal about the press's negative influence on suicide. Local media got letters from the Annenberg Public Policy Center that warned that if the first suicide gets media attention, then it's more apt to trigger another suicide.
We're not saying to censor the news, but we're asking the news media to think a little harder about what they report, because by reporting it, they could be perpetuating the story.
October, we've seen an explosion of coverage. Everyone from the Boston Globe to Forbes to Iran's international paper to our very own Palo Alto Weekly, who I should mention all along has covered teen suicide really carefully and very sensitively. So just some titles from then. Teen train suicide cluster shakes affluent California town. I like that one. Fourth suicide victim at California school. Gun commonly reeled after fourth apparent teen suicide in 6 months. Slow the trains. Palo Alto looking for ways to stop youth suicides. This is the point where media outlets begin to have this whole meta conversation about what it means for the press's coverage to potentially romanticize suicide by sensationalizing it or not being thorough enough with reporting to really tell a full, fleshed-out story. From about October on, it was more obvious to me those articles that spent the time to write a comprehensive story versus those that just brushed over the surface to move on to the next thing. Various local and regional TV networks have reported this story, mostly after the October suicides, and the CBS video I watched provided a really smart commentary on how coverage of this issue could possibly be contributing to it. I also found social networking communities like Twitter to be pretty effective at spreading word once the clusters began to emerge, but as is true with sites like Twitter, Facebook, and MySpace, it's hard to get too much information on someone unless you're their friend. That's it for this evening. Thanks for the great quarter.